The first time Eleanor Whitmore ever lied to her husband, she was 58 years old and standing in the produce aisle of the ShopRite on Route 46, holding a single ripe avocado as though it were a grenade. "Pick up milk, Ellie," Richard had said that morning, the same way he had said it every Tuesday for the last 37 years, his eyes never leaving the financial news on his tablet. 2%, the blue cap, and don't let them charge you for those rotten avocados again. She had smiled the small automatic smile she had perfected decades ago, the one that said, "Of course, darling, anything you need," and driven the 10-year-old Camry to the store exactly as she had every Tuesday since the children left for college and never really came back. But today, when the teenage cashier with purple streaks in her hair asked, "Paper or plastic, ma'am?" Eleanor heard herself answer, "Neither, thank you. I'm going somewhere else afterward." And the lie tasted like copper and freedom on her tongue. She paid for the milk, left the avocado on the conveyor belt like an offering, and walked out without it. Outside, the October sky was the color of a bruised peach. Eleanor stood on the asphalt, clutching the plastic bag with the blue-capped milk, and felt something inside her chest crack open, the way ice splits on a pond in early spring. Sudden, loud, irreversible. She did not go home. Instead, she drove east, past the garden center where she had once spent entire Saturdays choosing perennials Richard later complained were too flashy, past the country club where she had hosted countless brunches for his colleagues' wives, past the neat green sign that read, "You are now leaving Fairfield, come back soon," until the suburbs thinned into pine barrens and the radio dissolved into static. She pulled over at a derelict Sunoco station, its pumps long removed, and cried so hard the steering wheel blurred. Not pretty crying, ugly, gulping, decades-delayed sobs that tore out of her like something trying to be born. She cried for the art degree she abandoned when Richard said teaching was a hobby, not a career. For the trips to Paris and Morocco she forfeited because the firm needed him in Tokyo that year, and someone had to stay with the children. For the nights she lay awake listening to him snore while she cataloged all the pieces of herself she had quietly buried so the house could run smoothly and his shirts could stay starched and his ego could remain undisturbed. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her beige cardigan, the one Richard liked because it didn't draw attention, and looked at the woman in the rearview mirror. The woman looked back with swollen eyes and 35 years of practiced invisibility etched into her skin. "Not anymore," Eleanor whispered, and the sound of her own voice, raw, certain, shocked her more than the lie about the avocado. She drove another hour, past the last exits for anywhere familiar, until she reached the Jersey Shore and its off-season emptiness. The boardwalk in Point Pleasant was deserted, the arcade games shuttered, the air thick with salt and ending. She parked, kicked off her sensible flats, and walked barefoot onto the cold sand. The ocean roared its ancient indifference, and for the first time in her adult life, Eleanor screamed into it. One long, ragged scream that held every unsaid word of the last 4 decades. Gulls scattered. A jogger 30 yards away glanced over, startled, then kept running. Good, she thought. Let them look. That night, she checked into a faded motel called the Sea Whisper Inn, under the name Ellie Hart, her maiden name, the one she hadn't written since 1987. The clerk, a woman roughly her daughter's Claire's age with a nose ring and kindness in her eyes, didn't blink. Eleanor paid cash from the emergency 100 she kept folded in her wallet for hurricanes that never came. In the room that smelled of mildew and old sunshine, she sat on the chenille bedspread and made 2 decisions. First, she would not go home tomorrow. Second, she would find out who she still was when no one needed her to be anything at all. The next morning, she walked into a small art supply shop on Bay Avenue because the bell over the door sounded like laughter. The owner, a wiry man with paint ground permanently into his cuticles, looked up from restocking brushes. "I used to paint," Eleanor said, the words surprising them both. "Used to is just about to wearing yesterday's clothes," he replied, and handed her a beginner's watercolor set without asking questions. She bought it with the last of her cash, plus a 9x12 pad of cold-pressed paper, and took them back to the motel. For 3 days, she did nothing but sit on the narrow balcony facing the ocean and paint the same wave over and over until it stopped looking like the waves in the Thomas Kincaid prints Richard insisted on hanging in the den and started looking like something furious and alive.
On the 4th day, she called her oldest friend Marian, who had divorced 20 years ago and whom Richard dismissed as a bad influence, and told her everything. Marian listened without interruption, then said, "I've got a spare room in Asbury. Come tonight. Bring the paints." Eleanor hung up, looked at the 10 missed calls from Richard glowing on her phone, and turned it off. The spare room in Marian's narrow Victorian smelled of turpentine and possibility. Marian herself, silver-haired, unapologetic, magnificent, poured them both large glasses of cheap red wine and toasting, "To the first day of the rest of your glorious, selfish life." For weeks, Eleanor moved through the world like someone relearning how to breathe. She cut her hair to her chin, the gray left proudly untouched. She bought jeans for the first time since 1979 and wore them with the defiance of a teenager. She painted every morning until her fingers cramped, great slashing canvases full of color she had once been told was too much. Marian introduced her to a circle of women artists who met Thursday nights in a converted garage studio, women who swore freely, laughed loudly, and never once asked what her husband did for a living. In November, she sold her first painting, a turbulent seascape in blues and violets that made the buyer cry, to a gallery in Red Bank for more money than Richard's annual Christmas bonus. She stared at the check for a long time, then endorsed it Ellie Hart and opened her own bank account. Richard, meanwhile, was unraveling in Fairfield. The dry cleaner called to ask why Mr. Whitmore's shirts hadn't been picked up. The firm's holiday party loomed without a hostess. Their daughter Claire left frantic voicemails. "Mom, Dad says you're having a breakdown. Are you safe? Are you coming home for Thanksgiving?" Their son Drew texted a single line. "What the is going on?" Eleanor listened to the voicemails once, then deleted them. She spent Thanksgiving eating lobster rolls on the boardwalk with Marian and 6 other women who told stories of their own jailbreaks. Someone passed around a joint. Eleanor took a polite hit and coughed so hard she saw stars, but she laughed harder than she had in years. December brought a letter from Richard's attorney, delivered to Marian's address because Eleanor had quietly forwarded her mail. Words like abandonment and marital assets and psychiatric evaluation swam on the page. She read it twice, folded it into a paper boat, and set it sailing in the toilet. On Christmas Eve, Claire showed up unannounced, eyes red from crying in the car. She stood in Marian's cluttered living room, clutching a tin of Eleanor's famous almond crescents, like a peace offering. "Mom," she said, voice cracking, "please come home. He's lost without you. We all are." Eleanor looked at her daughter, truly looked, for the first time in years. Claire was 34, married to a man who called her babe too loudly in public, already negotiating with herself about which dreams to postpone for the sake of her toddlers. The sight cracked something tender in Eleanor's chest, but it did not break her. "I'm not lost, darling," she said gently. "For the first time, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Claire cried harder. Eleanor held her the way she hadn't since Claire was small enough to fit inside her arms entirely, and whispered, "You don't have to live my life, or your father's version of it. You get to choose." Claire left the cookies and drove home through the snow. She called 2 weeks later to say she had enrolled in law school night classes. Richard was furious. Eleanor sent her daughter a set of oil paints and a note. "Paint the life you want, even if it scares them." Winter turned to spring. Ellie now, fully, rented a tiny apartment above a tattoo parlor in Asbury Park. The walls vibrated with bass from the shop below on Friday nights, and she loved it. She took a part-time job at the art supply store to cover rent, taught a beginner's watercolor class on Tuesdays to retirees who reminded her of her old self, and painted every spare hour. Galleries in Philadelphia and Brooklyn began showing her work. Critics used words like ferocious and late blooming, and a voice that refused to stay buried. In April, almost exactly 1 year after the avocado incident, She received an invitation to a group show in Manhattan. The opening fell on the same night as the Fairfield Country Club's Spring Gala, an event she had co-chaired for 15 years. Richard sent an email, his first direct contact in months, that managed to sound both pleading and imperious. "It would mean a great deal if you would accompany me. People are asking questions."
Ellie read it while drinking coffee on her minuscule balcony, the ocean glittering in the distance. She thought of the navy gown still hanging in her old closet, purchased months ago to match Richard's cummerbund. She thought of the women who would be there in pearls and desperation, smiling too widely while their husbands appraised younger wives across the ballroom. She typed a single line in reply. "I'm afraid I have a previous engagement with myself." Then she dressed in a crimson silk dress that clung to her body like a dare, slipped on heels high enough to make her laugh at the absurdity, and took the train into the city alone. The gallery was packed. Her 3 largest canvases, storms of color that looked like joy and rage having a fist fight, hung beneath spotlights. People she didn't know shook her hand and told her the paintings made them feel brave. A curator from the Whitney asked if she had representation yet. A woman in her 30s bought the centerpiece on the spot and whispered, "My mother never got the chance to do this. Thank you for doing it for both of us." At some point, Ellie found herself standing in front of her favorite piece, a massive canvas titled Resurrection, though she had almost called it "Fuck Your Blue Cap Milk," and realized she was crying. Not the ugly sobbing of the Sunoco station, but the quiet, astonished tears of someone who had crossed an ocean inside herself and finally reached the other shore. Later, on the late train home, she took out her phone and scrolled to Richard's name. Her thumb hovered. She could call and tell him about the sale, the curator, the woman who saw her dead mother in the paint. She could invite him to try to understand. Instead, she opened a new contact and typed Ellie Hart, pressed save, and smiled out the window at the dark water sliding past. The traditional housewife was gone. In her place stood a woman who had spent decades pouring herself into molds made by other people, only to discover that when she finally stepped out, she was not empty. She was full of color no one could contain.